Well, we're sitting in the new library. Today's the 12th of January 1998, and talking to John Munro, who was on the council of the college from 1988 to 1990, and was registrar of the college from 1993 to 1997. Where were you born?
I was born in Edinburgh.
Were you?
Yeah. By a strange coincidence. My mother was here at the time, but my father was in the Indian Civil Service and here on me.
And did you go back to India?
Yes.
And how long did you live in India for?
I came here, I was sent back to go to school when I was age 5.
Right. And where did you go to school, first of all?
Initially I went to Edinburgh Academy.
Right. And how long did you do at Edinburgh Academy?
1 year.
And then where did you go?
Well, what happened was my father was invalided home from India,
Right.
and then war broke out, and he went down south, and we all went down south, and I went to a place called Chigwell School, which is in Essex.
Right. And how long did you stay there?
For a long time. I've missed a school. I've missed the name of the preparatory school I went to. I can't even remember what it was, but I went to Chigwell when I was,
That was secondary school?
Well, it was both, and I went when I must have been about 8, I suppose.
Right.
And I stayed there until I left, and I was just 18 when I left.
Did you enjoy school?
I think so, yes. I mean, one remembers parts of it with great affection.
What class do you remember with affection?
Quite a few of the subjects. At that time I was mainly interested in history and in English, and I really enjoyed them. Some of the sport, some of it. I think I was a rebel even at school. I used to, for example, admit to doing things which I hadn't done because the class was going to be disciplined unless the person owned up, and it was an odd quirk of my personality. I was quite happy to take the blame for it.
Why were you interested in English and history? Was that because of English and history, or because the teachers were good?
I think it was both. There was the history teacher was somebody who certainly was very inspiring.
And what sort of history was that?
It was mainly medieval.
Yes. And does that stay with you, or have you lost it?
Completely.
You wouldn't know Richard III from Henry II?
Almost not.
Right. And do you still have contacts with people who were at school with you?
Very, very few. I have contacts with somebody who came for my last year from the States, funnily enough, and we communicate regularly. And when I've been to New York, I visited him. And very occasionally I make contact with other people when they come to Edinburgh, but I don't have regular Christmas card kind of contact.
Yeah. And what about science? Did you do science at all? But that's it, no. And was that because science wasn't particularly well taught, or because it was not?
It's difficult to tell. I guess it wasn't taught with inspiration. I remember science as being a fairly dull subject. But I think also I wasn't particularly interested in it, so it worked both ways.
Right.
But it was, my education was almost classical. I did Latin, and I also, for a short period of time, did Greek.
Right.
So it didn't have the kind of science input to it.
And then you came to the end of... Were you good at school? Were you successful academically?
I don't know if I lived up to my early promise. I think that I suffered from sitting whatever they were then called at a very early age, and then taking the whatever are now called A-levels. And everybody expected me to kind of shine at entrance examinations, and although I didn't shine in the way people expected.
Yeah. And what about sport? What sports did you do at school?
I played everything fairly badly. I played cricket, I ran, it was a soccer school, I played football.
Right. And did you play hockey?
No.
That was a later development. Right. And did you bowl left-handed, semi-slow stuff in those days?
Right-handed.
Right-handed, was it? Right.
Yes, I did. I considered myself to be an all-rounder about it as well.
And then you came to the end of school, and what happened then?
Well, what basically happened was that I had actually been offered a place in Oxford to read history, and I underwent what certainly to some extent was a religious experience, and decided that I didn't want to read history, and that I wanted to do medicine.
What made you think that?
Well, I think it was kind of doing good for humanity, the kind of Schweitzer type approach to the world. And it became, I was very convinced that that was what I wanted to do. I also realized that it had been a very sudden change. And the compromise was to do my national service first.
Yeah. And were there influences on you, your father wasn't a doctor, was he?
There were no influences at all.
No. Reading or?
Well, I think there was reading influence. Yes. But there was a religious influence.
Right.
We had not been brought up. My grandfather was a minister, and because of that, I think we were almost a non-religious family.
Right.
And I went through a fairly intense, and I would openly say fairly short period of faith.
Right.
And it was during that I made that decision.
And you weren't deterred by the lack of science or anything like that?
I was almost stimulated by it, challenged by it.
Right. And then, in a way, did you see this as the first time you were stimulated or challenged in that way?
At the time, it was a conviction. And I don't think I'd properly worked it out.
No.
What I actually did, my family at this time were living in Germany. And I had actually boarded for the last year and a bit. Maybe, it wasn't 2 years. So I was very much so on my own. But one of the things I did was I actually came up with great arrogance, I came up to Edinburgh and asked them if they would offer me a place at medical school on the results that I then had. So that, I was thinking that way ahead, but I hadn't.
Did they accept you?
They did.
Right. That was visionary of them, wasn't it?
I think they were so surprised by this unusual approach.
But it's curious because Edinburgh was very susceptible to those approaches, wasn't it? My brother got in on a similar approach.
I think at that time it had a much more Catholic approach to people wanting to come.
Yes. So you then embarked on this great adventure of national service.
I joined, yes, I did my national
and what
service.
happened? Which?
Well, I went into the RAMC quite deliberately.
Right.
And I'd heard about a course. I heard about that you could train to become a physiotherapist.
Right.
And I told them that's what I wanted to do. And I was the first and equal last national serviceman to get onto the course. That they said I had to enroll as a regular to do it. And it just so happened that the course started very shortly after I completed my basic training. And I just went on saying it, and they said, okay, you can do it.
Yes.
And that was a fantastic experience.
How long was the course for?
The course was really for a year. It was for 10 months without holiday. And then you had a break at the end, and you went, which was embarkation leave, and then you were posted.
Right. And where was the course held?
It was in Netley, which is just...
Yes. Yes. And was that it? What was so good about it? What did you find so...
everything. That it was a different experience from me, from leaving school, leaving what had been a fairly elitist background, to discover that there were people who hadn't anything like my educational opportunities, but who were every bit as smart as me, or more. That we were a very closely knit group. There were it was a mixture of male and female people on the course. And the teaching was inspirational. It was. I would actually go as far as to say, even bearing in mind what we both experienced in Edinburgh, the anatomy was better anatomy than I was taught as a medical student.
So you came, in fact, into we will go on to that later, at medical school with a background of awareness of anatomy.
Considerable knowledge of anatomy.
Yeah. And functional anatomy,
Yes.
as opposed to right. And then where were you posted to?
I went back to Germany. I was posted to a place called Eastwood.
Was that a happy experience?
It was a memorable experience. I continued to exhibit greater rebel factor than I had exhibited at school. I found army discipline quite incredible. And some of the things that happened to me confirmed that. You know, I was once charged for dumb insolence, which I'm sure you could appreciate, but it left me speechless. I was charged for leaving the physio department and walking to a ward in, I think it was something like 25 degrees of frost, with my hands in my pockets in order to minister unto the people in the ward. Looking back on it, I was actually victimized, and I didn't realize that at the time, but I now also realize why I was victimized, because I committed the unforgivable crime of being a non-officer who was dating an officer quarang, and that, you know, is something that you just don't do in the army. But I enjoyed it enormously. I played a terrific amount of sport, you know, that I represented. It was quite a small unit, and I represented them in just about everything. That's where I started playing hockey.
Right. And what position did you start playing in hockey?
It was midfield something. I think it was what was then left back. You know,
right.
I played. Yeah.
And then you came to the end of your time in the army, RMC.
Yes.
And then what happened?
Well, I then had 6 months to waste, and I took on a variety of jobs. My recollection is the longest. Yes, that's right. I worked for Wall's Ice Cream in Acton, and became what's called a freezerman, which actually was promotion. Mr. Wall had spotted me as a bright lad, and I produced. I had 3 people working under me by the time I left. And we froze the ice cream that was then sold in little 3p blocks. So that was fun as well.
And then you came up to Edinburgh.
Yeah.
And where did you stay there? Were you in?
Well, I went into the halls of residence for the first year.
Was that a good idea?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, for 1 year, I mean, you got to know a lot of people. You got to know people in other faculties. Yes.
Which hall?
I was in Salisbury Green.
Right. Was that a big hall or?
Quite small. I can't tell you the exact.
No,
number.
but it was
you
not.
know, it was 40 odd people.
Right. Could you choose which hall you went to, or did you?
I can't recall.
No.
You know, I went to Salisbury Green, and
Yes.
as far as I was concerned.
Yes.
You know, I didn't really know any options.
And then in first year, you
First year was hard.
Was it?
Yeah.
Now, tell me about first year. Who taught you in first year? Well, in zoology.
Well, Swan in zoology.
Swan. And how did he affect you?
Well, I remembered some of his antics, which were, I don't know, he affected me in any sort of way. I mean, I thought that he had a reasonable approach to education. The chap in physics was Deacon, what was his name? You must know.
Yes, it was Jack. Oh, heck, I had the name. Jack Dainty.
Dainty, that's right.
Yes.
I mean, I didn't relate to him in any empathetic sort of way at all.
But he was interesting, wasn't he? Because he attempted to teach physics in a way that was relevant to medical students.
Yes, but I knew no physics.
Right. And how birds flew and up, whatever.
Yeah, but I mean,
thermal lifts.
I had, during the 6 months between ending and starting, I had been doing some reading on my own. But I learned physics like a parrot, and I didn't understand it, and therefore it was very difficult.
Must have been awful.
Yeah.
Yes.
And the same was true for quite a bit of chemistry.
Well, the chemistry was the only hard bit, wasn't it, at first year? I mean, with Neil Campbell and...
Yes. I mean, we had organic chemistry in first year. I mean,
yes.
I found that much easier because, in actual fact, I was starting, I think, at the same position as a lot of other people,
yes.
Who were beginning organic chemistry. But the rest of it was...
A bit like anatomy, isn't it? Sort of blobs moving around a bigger blob. And...
anatomy
organic, both, but organic chemistry.
Yeah, I'd have said more like biochemistry.
Yes.
I mean, it's
yes.
extension.
And botany, did that?
Oh yes, I've enjoyed the botany. I found travelling down on the Saturday morning. But, yes,
and that man just
quite
behind the
entertaining.
plant pots.
Yes, I found it much more entertaining than I think a lot of other people in the year who
yes.
felt it was totally irrelevant. It was all irrelevant as far as I was concerned.
How did you find coming from the army and being older than some, though in our year there were people who were mature like Doone and Alla and Peter McMullen. How did you find coming into...
There were actually quite a number of people who had done national service.
Yes.
And therefore it wasn't something that I found unusual or bizarre. I think that, it sounds rather condescending. I think that one was aware of the fact that one was more experienced than other people. But that, that it's a long period of time.
Yes.
I think national service was a way of growing up quickly. I mean, there's no doubt about that.
And did you find the course at Netley enabled you to learn in a way that was different from that at school? Did it?
Yes. I think it enabled me to learn in a way that was different to the way I had to work in the first year. I mean, first year was undoubtedly the most difficult year.
But you found a way of learning with cards and the like, which was quite singular, wasn't it? I mean, there are not many people learned that way.
If you say so. My recollection is that the cards were something I developed in Netley.
Right.
In fact, I'm sure it was.
Yes. And was that in parallel with Netley or your own idea?
It was my own idea.
Right, right. So you got through first year.
Yeah.
And then you came into your own, really, didn't you, in second and third year?
Well, I was suddenly at an advantage rather than at a disadvantage.
Yes. Did you have to work in the holidays?
In first year I did. I mean, it really was. It was trying to learn things I didn't understand, which was very difficult.
Yes.
I don't think I did then after, but I always worked harder than I let people know, if you know what I mean. I did actually work really quite consistently rather than revise for exam.
Yes. So you came into anatomy, physiology and biochemistry. How did you start with anatomy, because you were the gold medalist in anatomy, weren't you?
Yes.
Yes. How did you find that? What was for example, lecturing, I mean, which was from a totally different point of view, wasn't it?
Yes.
Of functional, it was embryonic.
Yes. Well, I found it fascinating.
Did you?
Yeah.
And did you strike up rapport with George Romanes then, or?
I like to think so. I don't know. I mean, you'd have to ask him. I think he found me a rather kind of disruptive, scruffy character. I think I was. you know, but I enjoyed him enormously.
Yes.
You know, I felt that, you know, I felt that this was marvellous. I don't think I missed any of his lectures, you know, that it was something that I really enjoyed watching him perform. And they were performances.
Yes.
It was much more that.
Do you think you'd prefer him to, say, E.B. Jameson and the more...
Yes.
Yes. And then what? And did you enjoy the anatomy, like the section?
The section. I mean, I found it a bit of a waste of time, to be quite frank with you. I mean, a lot of the limb dissection was, you know, stuff that I didn't really get excited about, because I really knew the limb anatomy in particular. I knew it very well. We seemed to spend a terrific amount of time actually doing what seemed to be very little. But I mean, I didn't kind of react adversely to it in any way.
Well, you were a lucky man, weren't you? Sort of the day that you skipped with the small intestine, you know, to be still.
Well,
I mean, anyhow, what about physiology? How did you enjoy physiology?
I regret my, you know, I think I discovered that physiology was a much more important subject than anatomy, you know, once I graduated. And I regret the fact that I didn't actually work harder at physiology, you know, that I didn't find it difficult. I enjoyed it, but I didn't get immersed in it in any extent.
Did you find the lecturing much less stimulating?
Yes, and I think that was it. I found the lecturing, it didn't bring the subject alive in a way that, you know, physiology could be brought alive.
Yeah. And the trouble was that there wasn't a good textbook, was there? And we were denied the only textbook that looked vaguely interesting.
And the practical physiology was fairly impractical.
Awful, wasn't it? And what about biochemistry?
Well, biochemistry to some extent was... biochemistry was okay. It was a learning exercise, and I had learnt how to remember things, you know, and did so.
And that was pure learning, wasn't it? I mean, Marion rarely lectured to us, and...
I mean, at that time I had what I suppose some people would call as a photographic memory. And I used to remember closing textbooks, you know, and saying, I know it, which I wouldn't dare do in latter life, but, you know, and could go into the exam and do it. But it was that kind of an exercise. It was a means to an end.
Yes. So we came through that period and we went into transitional term, didn't we, which was really...
Tarara Todd.
You got Tarara Todd. Tell us about Tarara Todd.
I mean, I know that he was in his day somebody who was very able. I think by the time I got him, that could not be said of him. And I look back on him and actually feel very sorry for it. I mean, there were some very embarrassing things that happened. I remember him teaching on the wrong patient and giving people, you know, bollocking or not describing this person who was obviously, one with hindsight, dying of some horrible malignancy. And he thought he was teaching on a patient who'd had a heart attack or something like that, and it became very, very embarrassing. But the SHO in the unit was a chap by the name of Norman Allen.
Right.
And he was good, and he took an interest, and he kept the kind of enthusiasm going.
Right. Because there was great emphasis with Tarara on fingernails. Shoe cleanliness and other important things.
I mean, the story that didn't affect me, but the story about Tarara Todd, I'm happy to recount is the Leslie Duncan story. That Leslie had graduated as a vet before he went into medicine, and in his finals he was asked to examine this patient a middle-aged patient with cholecystitis and was appropriately obese. And before he went in to see her, I said, "What's that tie you're wearing?" And he said, "It's thick neck tie." I said, "No right to wear that tie." He said, "I'm qualified for it." And then 10 minutes later, the screen suddenly blew back. There was Tararo talking, "Come on, the patient up! It's not a cow you're examining!" But he was a caricature of a type that one wouldn't want to base oneself on.
No. Were you invited to one of his special evenings?
I was indeed, yes.
What were they like?
They were good, actually. I mean, he tried to unbend. He tried to, present himself in a different sort of way, and tried to get to know people, in a personal sort of way. I think he probably found that really quite difficult. But, that is something that I would remember with affection rather than not.
They played party games, didn't they?
Yes, they did. And, I mean, he tried very hard, but it was stilted and it was artificial.
Yes. And wasn't there the no smoking, and the lavatory was packed with people having a fag, sort of.
Yeah. That's right.
And then what happened then about pathology and bacteriology? How did you enjoy those?
Pathology, bacteriology I enjoyed. I think I enjoyed it more. And I was spotted there by Jerry Colley, who took me aside and said to me that he was very nice. He kind of said to me that I had potential and could he not help me to realise it? And that was encouraging, very encouraging. Yeah.
He had an enormous influence on people,
Yes,
didn't he?
he did.
Yes.
Yeah.
And what about pathology? You must have taken to that as an extension of anatomy.
Yes and no. I suppose it was all part and parcel of building something up. But I was much more interested in the clinical aspects of anything at this stage. I always had been. I mean, I'd undergone. I mean, the desire to do medicine as a result of my physio experience had enormously increased, and the reasons for wanting to do it had completely changed.
Yes.
So that there was this impatience about starting to do proper medicine.
Yes. And what about pharmacology? How did you find that?
Enormously interesting. That was, I suppose, one of my pharmacology and the way it linked in with therapeutics.
Now, was this because Gaddam was an inspiring teacher?
Yes.
What did you find? How did you find Gaddam, and what was inspiring about him?
Well, I mean, again, you remember Gaddamist stories about the cat that he'd filled up with morphine and things like that.
Yes.
But he made the subject come alive in a way that I don't think anybody in pathology made. It's difficult to say that pathology can become alive, but he gave it a relevance to therapeutics, which I don't think, and my feeling about pathology had.
But it's interesting, isn't it? Because we were exposed to some very big brains, like Whitridge, like Marion, like the zoologist, and others. And yet he was a man whose intellect came through in a quite different way, wasn't it? It was a very warm intellect. It was one that if you can use that phrase.
Yeah, you've got it. I mean, that is the difference, and that he was very, very human.
Yes.
In a way that people like Whitridge weren't.
Yeah. But he came in carpet slippers, but that was just as an aside, wasn't it? But I mean, it was the intellect that was warm and attractive. Yes. And yet, curiously, not a lot of our year became pharmacologists. There was George Munro. Yes. But not many others. And then, which was the first ward that you went into after Tarara, medical ward?
I think it was probably Stanley Davidson.
Right.
Because the next kind of big influence was Andrew Doig. And Andrew Doig again kind of took me aside and, was very supportive at a personal level.
And this was on Derek's...
Stanley's.
Yes. And what was that setup like? Did you ever see Stanley?
No.
Right. So you were taught primarily by Andrew Doig. Tell us about Andrew.
Well, he came over as somebody who... It's always difficult to tell me then about somebody who, of course, I've known ever since.
Yes.
But I think he came over as, first of all, being genuinely committed to medicine, committed to teaching of medicine. That he gave the impression that he took personal interest in the students, and certainly on a number of occasions, I can remember after we'd handed in our case histories, he called me, asked me to see him, and made comments about the case history, and encouraged me. He was very, very encouraging. And I think he was one of the first people who made me aware of the importance of not being critical, but being complimentary about things, and that just the slightest inkling that you were doing well was a huge stimulus to making you try harder. Mm-hmm. Having said all that, he was somebody who I suppose I found slightly distanced. I certainly found him more distanced than I had found Norman Allen, who was immediately very, you just felt that he was on a slightly different plane.
In a way, how you expected a doctor to be like.
Yes, rather.
Yes, yes. And then you moved... Then you'd go into surgery, presumably. You started surgery somewhere about then.
Somewhere about then, yes. Oh gosh, this is where I just said to somebody recently, I couldn't remember 30 years ago. My short-term memory wasn't up to it. This is going back a bit further than that. The butcher.
Yes.
There were a lot of them in those days. But
Adamson.
Yes. Bill Adamson.
Septic.
Yes.
Septic Bill Adamson. Yes.
That was it. Yes, Jim Jeffries as well. Now, Adamson, that was interesting because it actually, from this kind of rather meticulous approach to medicine, particularly Andrew Doig meticulous approach, Bill Adamson seeing new outpatients at the rate of 5 every minute, or maybe 1 every 5 minutes, I'm not certain which. It changed your thinking, and it made you say, well, this guy actually... But at the same time, you had to respect the fact that he seemed to be quite frequently right. He was jumping your thinking process.
Was he a good teacher, or was he intuitive?
He was intuitive.
Yes.
And Jolly Jim was a non-event, and I can't remember the junior staff there, which is interesting.
Yes.
I can't.
But it's interesting with Jim Jeffries because he was Learmonth's golden boy, wasn't he? Left high and dry in the succession, and presumably either that was a reason why or consequence of that. Yeah. And then where did you go after that?
Well, I went to the Eastern and worked with Alistair Bruce and Porky Slater. And Alistair Bruce, at the end of my attachment, asked me into his office and said, because if you remember these were the days before prams and everything like that, asked me if I would like his job. And I, as tactfully as I could, said to him, "You must be joking," but I had assumed at that stage that he was offering me a house officer job.
Yes.
And as you know, when he retired, I found to my distress that I got his job. That was good, but again, that was that was very good, but that was largely the responsibility of the resident, whose name I've forgotten, but who was absolutely fantastic, and she spent a lot of time with me, and I was a gatehouse student, and Brenda is somebody, but I have forgotten her name.
Yeah.
And she was very important.
So the gatehouse at Easton was very important as well, wasn't it?
No,
Because that enabled one to be part of Easton, and unlike some other hospitals where one felt extra, there was something quite special about the Easton, wasn't there, the gatehouse? Did you do obs and gynae, which presumably didn't make an enormous impact on you?
Well, yes, it did, actually. It made a huge impact on me. I mean, it's the one...
As a user or a student?
No, interest. I was very interested in
Right.
obs and gynae.
Who taught you?
Again, I've forgotten his name, the bluff guy at the Western.
McGregor. Yes.
Who I didn't get on at all well with. I mean, that wasn't the thing that interested me. I just found the whole concept of obs and gynae very interesting. I think it's. I got the medal in obstetrics and gynecology. I think it was the one career decision I made when I put, family commitment above professional interest. But, if you remember at that time, senior registrars were still living in the place like Simpson, and I think I made a positive decision that I just wasn't prepared to do that.
Because you were the first of the year to marry, weren't you?
I must have been one of the first of the year.
Yes.
To marry,
Yes. Which year did you marry?
I got married at the end of 5th year, so I married with a year to go.
No, we were married before you.
You were married?
Yeah.
Right.
Anyhow. Who else did you get exposed to? Did you after
Well, in
Stanley?
medicine, I worked in Derryton Watch.
Right. And how did that go? What was that like?
That was certainly as an undergraduate, I'd say that was the most important attachment, and I desperately wanted to become his resident.
Was this the realisation of the dreams that you had of medicine? Was this the sort of
Yes.
embodiment of your vision of medicine?
Yes, it was. I mean, it's again, I don't know to what extent it's influenced by working with him as a resident rather than working with him as a student. He was a great showman. He was a great, but beneath that, he was sincere and committed. Well, at least that was my belief, and is my belief of him.
Yes.
And that that he. Obviously, some of the things that I got to know when I was his resident, I didn't know when he was his student. But he used to come in every Sunday, unless he was out of Scotland, and he used to do a ward round with Kate Anderson and his resident. And although he might have expected other members of the staff to be in, he didn't let them go on that ward round. And this was really the time when he got to know the patients and also got to know his residents. And you saw him when there was no show, there was no, he wasn't performing in front of anybody. He was sitting at the bedside and holding people's hands and doing things like this. And it had a very profound effect.
Yes. Who else was? Do you remember as a student who else was there in that ward teaching?
Well, Lindsay Lamb was there, and then at the one step down level, there was this extraordinary bunch of people. There was Alan Smith, there was Leslie Duncan. I think there was James Irvine, who was and there was Makash Murdoch. So that was extraordinarily intense. Oh no,
Jim Robson?
No, Jim Robson. My recollection was just kind of made it, hadn't he? But Tony Seaton was there.
Right.
David Seaton was there.
Yes.
So James Irvine must have joined it after, when I was either a house officer or even an SHO.
Right.
Because he was not in the teaching staff. But it was very high caliber teaching. Very high caliber.
Yes.
And they used to vie with each other, of course. I mean, particularly Leslie Duncan and Makash Murdoch, they were always trying to score off each other in front of the students.
What about your second surgical job? Surgical clinic. Who was that with?
I think it was at the Western with Charles Faulkner and Bill Small. In fact, it certainly was.
Right.
And was good fun, but didn't inspire me to want to do surgery. In fact, I never really had a desire to do surgery at all.
Right. And you finished with honours, and you then went on to do your house jobs. Now, who were your house jobs with?
Well, the first was with Derek.
Was it?
Yeah.
Yes.
And I think in terms of influence, that was some of the most critical. That was a very critical period of time. And I then.
But what was particular about it? Why did you find? What was the process that you found exciting? I mean, what was the thinking that you found activated you?
Commitment? I think everybody, we worked as a team. Kate Anderson was an extraordinary person. She either hated you or loved you, and I think I was fortunate in as much as the resident immediately before me had fallen into the former category.
Right.
And I got on well with Kate, and I think that made a huge influence on how your 6 months went, quite honestly. Talking to some people who did not obviously have that kind of relationship with it. But there was this feeling that we were all working as a team, and that there was a common sense of commitment in me.
And the intellect, presumably.
Oh, sure, yes, but I mean, on the top of it, this extraordinary figure.
Did he have enormous attention to detail, or was he intuitive?
He was intuitive, but he was incredibly. I mean, he was extraordinarily human, and I don't know if I've ever told you this story, but I will repeat it. That after the Abbott twins had been transplanted, he came in the following morning, and I was working, and this must have been at 8 o'clock or even before it, with his hands deep in his pocket, as was his wont, and kind of shaking a few coins in one of the pockets, and he said, oh well, I don't know what the world is coming to. Soon it'll be a social embarrassment to be found with two of anything. And he walked out. And, I thought that he'd gone around telling this remark to a lot of other people, and to the best of my knowledge, I was the unique recipient of it.
Yes, yes.
But he was terribly human, and he obviously was very interested in patients as individuals, and this was the thing that I think had the biggest influence.
Yes.
He remembered them. There were times when obviously he was desperately trying to remember somebody who he didn't remember. But a lot of them he remembered. They'd been in there 4 years ago. He said, yes, the butcher, or this. And he had a very good recollection of individual patients.
And was he good therapeutically?
Yeah, I think he was very good therapeutically. I mean, he was not a major interventionist. I mean, he was very prudent in the way he
I met a man the other day who was one of the first to have steroids with asthma. He'd been in Ward 3 for 6 months and was dying. and Derek drifted in and said, "I will cure you in 3 days." And this man is still fit and well now, having been sort of practicing for the pearly gates. And he remembers Derek as a vision that hardly saw him before or after this, but
you see, I mean, that is the worst side of Derek. I mean, that's the showman side. I will cure you in 3 days.
Yes.
And a lot of people actually never got beyond it. You know, that's what rather switched them off. But
why did he do that, do you think?
I don't know. I just don't know. I mean, it worked incredibly effectively when he was teaching, of course. You know, I thought his therapeutic lectures were inspirational.
Yes. Yeah.
But he didn't need to do it on the wardrobe. No. And he did. But he was putting on a show. I almost got the impression that it was because it was what was expected of him.
Yes.
You know. But then you see the Sunday thing, there was none of that.
No.
Absolutely none of it.
Where did you do his surgical house job?
I went to Bexhill.
Where's that?
That's in the south coast of Sussex. I went there because it did have married accommodation.
Right.
We'd drawn up a short list of married accommodation. And it was a very important and valuable experience. When I went, I was the only resident. It was a 60-something bedded hospital with medicine and surgery. And very quickly the local GPs got me to give opinions about the medicine. I actually did a lot of medicine when I was there. The surgery was run by people coming out from Hastings. And actually I had more experience, personal responsibility is a word. I had more responsibility at Bexhill than I think I had until I became a senior registrar. And the casualty department was busy and was left on one's own. And quite honestly, the thing that kept you going was saying, if I'm not doing this job, somebody who probably didn't even qualify in the UK would be doing it. You had to kind of keep saying that to yourself, because you knew you were doing some pretty horrendous thing.
And very tired.
Yeah, I think the stress was more than the tiredness to it. Yes. I mean, the hand trauma, they wouldn't take it when it came in, that this was something that they expected the person at Bexhill to do. And, I used to lop off fingers and, think about Jib Jones when I was doing it.
Yes.
And it was difficult.
Yeah.
It was difficult.
And then you came back to Edinburgh. Mm-hmm. To where?
Well, I came back as Derek's SHO.
Right.
Shortly before I left, I'd been aware of his presence at the end of the ward, and he just went like this, trotted down and said to me, wondered if I would like to be his SHO. He knew that I'd actually already been fixed up with a job, and that was with Lindsay Lamb to be his SHO, and he said, I've talked to Lindsay and he's very happy for me to invite you to do this. I don't want you to make a hurried decision, tell me in the morning.
What was Lindsay Lamb like?
Oh, Lindsay is great. I mean, it's not was. Lindsay's still alive. Lindsay and Derek were so opposite, and that's why they worked so well. They actually complemented each other. But I worked with Lindsay as a registrar and then a senior registrar.
And what kind of a doctor was he? What sort of a person?
Well, Derek said something about him which is terribly true, and that was, it's a pity that he's become a consultant, because it's a waste of a very good general practitioner.
Yes.
And, there is a certain truth about that. I mean, Lindsay was somebody who was very, very interested in you again as an individual, but he was, to use the word arrogant is very unfair in Lindsay, but he was actually more, whatever the word is, than Derek. I mean, he talked to people by their surname rather than in any other way, and he wouldn't put a handle onto it. He had this kind of slightly old-fashioned 19th century approach to it. But he was very caring and very committed, but he wasn't contemporary in his thinking. You could guess his politics in a way that you guess, Derek's politics. But I am enormously fond of Lindsay.
Yes.
I mean, Lindsay is somebody who I have very...
Was he a role model in any way?
Probably not, to be quite frank with you. I mean, that Leslie Duncan had got into that unit. Leslie Duncan was much more the role model when I was the registrar.
Yes. What tell us about Leslie?
No, I mean, in terms of intellect, Leslie, I'd have thought, must be in the very, very top bracket. I mean, he was quite exceptionally gifted, knowledgeable, but also intuitive. I mean, he was, in many ways, I'd have thought one of the best general physicians I ever worked with. Quite comprehensive in his knowledge. And then, as a diabetologist, of top international bracket, abrasive, sometimes deliberately abrasive with the British Diabetic Association, abrasive with the college, etc., etc. He was intolerant not just of fools, he was very intolerant, but enormously, I think, loved by his patients, and set up a kind of style of outpatient care, which I think was revolutionary at the time, when people were Christian named and all this kind of carry on. And I think all his staff would have done anything for him. They really would have.
Had he an original mind? Did he?
Oh, totally original. Yeah. The things that he was doing were innovative, and he never got credit for them. And a whole broad spectrum of things. And for example, the whole management of diabetic ketoacidosis he had rationalised long before people like Alberti came along and started chuntering about it. Oh, very innovative.
Was this because he was not a great writer, or because he was not a great...
He was anti-establishment. And being anti-establishment, meant he was anti-establishment. And that although he wrote quite a bit, he was never recognised for the contributions he was making. He didn't care.
No.
He really did not care about his image in any way. I mean, in some respects, the opposite of Derek, who I think did care about his image.
Yes.
Leslie, really.
So you did your year with Derek, and what was that?
Well, that wasn't with Derek.
Yes.
Because by the time I came back, there was a washing machine in the unit.
Right.
So I worked in the renal unit with Jim Robson.
So this was your first, when you came back to, so you went into renal medicine as your first...
Well, I was appointed as the SHO in the metabolic unit, which is Ward 21, and of course the metabolic unit became the renal unit.
Yes. And how did you fare there? I mean, first of all, how did you get on with Jim Robson?
We had some of the most extraordinary stand-up fights that I think he ever had with anybody. I resigned on one occasion. I enormously regarded his intellect. I didn't, to be quite frank with you, regard certain aspects of his ethics. There were ethical differences between him and me.
That's what you found yourself at odds with?
Yes.
Yes. Was that because the dialysis unit was very new then, wasn't it?
Yes.
And it was exploring ground that...
Yes. Everything you were doing was highly experimental.
Yes.
And you were making mistakes as you went along.
But was it not also the case that he saw dialysis as the only true way of dealing with end stage, if that's the word, renal failure?
I don't think he did, because he was very committed to renal transplantation.
Not always, was he? I mean, part of the problems that Woodruff had were that he didn't feel empathy.
Well, I think it was part of the problems that they both had, that they didn't relate to each other
Yes.
at a personal level.
Right.
But I think Jim Robson, I think Jim Robson saw a major role for renal transplantation. I think that there was a kind of scoring exercise going on. I mean, that they were too bright, they were too intellectually top quality people to actually, and their personalities were such they couldn't really work closely together. They had to compete together, right. And it did create problems.
Where in that did Anne Lambie fit? I mean, and where?
Well, Anne Lambie in the year I was there had a very miserable time. I mean, I used to, I spent I often slept there because we did all our dialysis at night in those days. And I reckoned that if Anne Lambie hadn't left Jim Robson's room in tears before 9:30, we were in for a bad day. If she'd left in tears before 8:30, we were in for a good day. He had to, in some odd sort of way, kind of break Anne every day. And once he'd done that, they worked much better together.
Was that because she was obstinate, or it strikes me that what you're describing are intransigent points of view in flexible situations?
Yes, I mean, Anne. I don't know if Anne was obstinate. I think Anne. It is a matter of being careful what I change, because I wouldn't have. I may have to tell you why I resigned over the issue, because actually puts the perspective right. I think Anne was genuinely more concerned about the patients than Jim Robson was, but at the same time she was very ruthless in pursuing her own research. And I don't know how often the rows they had, which were continuous, were related to Jim saying to her, "You can't do that on the patients under my care," or the other way around. I just don't know.
Right.
But the reason I resigned was there was a patient by the name of Bobby Kerr, who was at that time aged 12. And we were doing blood typing on all these chronic renal failures, looking for matches. And Bobby Kerr came from the borders, and his mother and his father blood matches were incredibly similar. It seems that there must have been some relationship between them too. And of course Bobby therefore became a very interesting transplant. And Bobby used to come in with acute on chronic renal failure. And we'd dialyze him a couple of times and he'd get over an intercurrent infection and carry on. And once this had all been found out, Jim Robson, when he came in the next time, he said, I want this chap kept uremic. We're going to get him transplanted. And I said, you can't do that. It's absolutely unacceptable. There's no way you can keep him going. And he said, well, stuff you, I'm going to do it. And I said, well, I'm off. And he then said to me, well, that is terribly selfish and pig-headed and all the rest of it, and think of all the other patients who are going to suffer. I give you my assurance you won't have anything to do with Bobby Kerr. Won't that resolve your conscience? And I said, okay, fair enough. So, not immediately, but that was what I finally agreed to. He got his transplant, and both Jim Robson and Anne Lambie left on some world jamboree. So I was actually looking after his medical aspects with Woody, so it was the very opposite. Now the reason why I tell you this is, of course, nowadays we wouldn't have allowed people to develop the kind of uremia that I thought Bobby Kerr should have developed. He was transplanted at about the right time. I think he's still alive. Jim Robson invited me to his 25th birthday after his transplantation. Now I think, I'm not trying to pretend that Jim knew that this was going to be so successful, but he certainly was aware of the fact that from a grouping point of view, Bobby Kerr was something slightly unique, something unusual. Now I don't know why I've said all that, but it shows the complexity of Jim Robson's character. Yes. And, after I left the unit, Jim, I think I like to think we mutually respected each other. We mutually respected each other's opinions. I remember on certain occasions he called me in and went through things with me, and then he would laugh and say, I'm just rehearsing the arguments that can be used against, And he used to wind me up, unashamedly wind me up. So I think Jim Robson is one of these people who probably made a much bigger contribution than Edinburgh has ever given him credit for.
Right. And then you moved to where as a registrar?
Well, I then moved to Lindsay Lamb.
Right.
And that was with...
That must have been felt like coming...
It was different.
Coming up from 120 miles an hour down to 60.
Well, not entirely, because there was Leslie Duncan.
Oh, right.
But the other person in the unit was John Matthews.
Right.
And, what Ward 21 in those days taught you, though you weren't aware of it, was the management of the acutely ill. Because, acute renal failure really embodied all the other, ICU interests. And you didn't get that in the same way.
And you did your registrar. At what point did you do your membership?
After I'd been a registrar for a year.
Right.
So that was
halfway through your time with...
Yes, roughly.
And your selected subject was?
Was renal physiology and disease.
Because if I remember right, you were one of the first to decide that you would sit the Edinburgh membership but not sit the London membership.
Well, I think it was my wife that decided it.
I remember a conversation with you about that as to yes. I think one of the few things that we ever agreed on. But there you expanded as a general physician, is that right? And with an interest in diabetes, would that be right?
Yes, it was. With an interest in diabetes, but also still with this hang-up about renal medicine.
Right.
You couldn't have been through that experience without
being affected.
Being affected by it, yeah.
And then so where did you then go as an SR?
Same place.
Same place.
At least I was appointed to the Royal.
Yes.
And I stayed with Lindsay for a bit. And then I went to the city for a year, and partly that was the pyelonephritis unit and the cash murder. And then I went to...
What was he like?
Oh, great chap.
And what was great about him?
Well, again, he was inspirational. The common factor is, I believe, is Derek Dunlop.
Yes.
That here you have Leslie Duncan influenced by Derek, and you have McCarish influenced by Derek. He was a very good teacher. He took his teaching much more seriously than a lot of people would give him credit for. And to what extent he was originally thinking, I'm not certain, but certainly some of the things that he introduced were highly original. Whether he picked them up from other people or not, I don't know. And he never got the credit for some of the concepts in antibiotic therapy that he developed. But he was obviously working in the same hospital as people like Crofton, and one doesn't know, where the ideas came from.
Yes.
But certainly he was advancing therapeutic frontiers and not ever given recognition for what he did.
And then you
Well, the other thing I did was I went down to the northern. I rotated as a senior registrar.
Yes.
I went and I did a chunk in rheumatology and a chunk in neurology.
Right. How did you enjoy them?
Very much. I found them very different. I found rheumatology was very general medicine, just with a slightly different slant to it. I found neurology was totally non-general medicine, and people kind of ridiculed you if you could, and that is unfortunately true. If you were saying, isn't it conceivable that there might be a general medical problem here rather than a straight neurological problem? So they were two very different experiences, but they were filling in what I felt were... Well, I suppose the rheumatology was going back to physio.
Yes.
And the neurology, because I felt I didn't know much neurology there.
And then what happened?
Well, these were the days when I started applying for jobs and applied for some jobs south of the border and discovered that not having a membership of the London College meant something.
Did you? Right. Yes.
Well, no, I don't know. I mean, I didn't get shortlisted for jobs, which surprised me.
Did you have a mentor at that point? I mean, Derek.
Oh, Leslie Duncan.
But Leslie was not the same sort of mentor as Derek or Stanley, was he? I mean, going back to...
Leslie was the guy who I saw as my mentor.
Yes. But it was an intellectual mentor rather than a status.
Well,
maybe
no. I mean, if you change the word mentor to guru, I mean, Leslie was the guy who would ask for an opinion.
Yes.
About career and things like this. And Leslie was the person who told me. There'd been a job which was due to come up, which I was waiting for, but not waiting for in any negative sort of way. I was applying for other jobs. And that was a job which was never advertised, but it was widely rumoured that they were going to make a consultant appointment to the transplant unit, working part-time there and part-time in the pyelonephritis unit at the City Hospital. And I saw that as a lovely job.
Yes.
And I was actually still doing clinics in the City Hospital because Makash Murdoch had obviously been involved in this, and he saw me as somebody who I think he would have welcomed working with him as a colleague. So I used to do that once a week, and I had kept up to date with renal medicine. And that job wasn't advertised, but the job at the Eastern was, and I was told I had to apply for it.
Right.
And
how did you feel about that? Did you feel...
I felt it was a terrible job. I went and looked at it. I went and looked at Eden Hall, and I actually wrote to the health board and asked them, I think it was 6 questions, because we'd been told very little information. And, some of the questions were really quite searching, but they all related to Eden Hall. To give you an example, the details had said that there was an opportunity to develop an outpatient clinic at Eden Hall. I went there and I said, well, where do you see outpatients? And the consultant there said, we don't see outpatients. And I said, well, what will my job be? And he said, well, I will be the senior consultant and you will be the other consultant. There are 60 beds, you will look after them and I will look after you. That wasn't what I was expecting. So I wrote these questions. And I'd said to Jeannie that if I didn't get the answer for them on the day of the interview, I wasn't going to even turn up. And on the day of the interview, I got the answer in written form, saying that these questions had been asked by one of the shortlisted candidates, and as they were so important, they were being sent to all the candidates. And a long 2-paragraph answer to each of my questions, which summarised itself as saying, don't know. And I interviewed on this. And of course, with hindsight, I think I was trying to throw the job. And with hindsight, everything I did ensured I was going to get offered the job.
Right.
Because, you're aware of the fact that if I knew what I was talking about. The other people hadn't even been to Eden Hall. Yeah. And I was saying, well, this is outrageous. It's a complete waste of beds, What are you going to do about it? And of course, I had some ideas. And then I got offered the job, and I actually said I would accept. It was a conditional acceptance. And I was told by the interviewing committee that they couldn't, they were only an advisory committee. They couldn't accept my conditions, but they would put in a very strong bid that they should be granted. So I accepted it on that understanding.
Who were your colleagues initially?
Well, at Eden Hall there was a chap called Randolph Russell, who was in his late 50s and who was he was physically ill. Yeah. And he was just not up to doing it, and he was desperate that nothing happened at Eden Hall to increase the workload. That was the essence of it. And at the Eastern there was Porky Slater, who again was somebody who I think was grossly undervalued in Edinburgh. Porky Slater, he lived under the shadow or under the oppression of Alistair Booth, but he was fantastic, and he was terribly supportive of me as a young, arrogant consultant moving in, and he really said, "The future is yours, and I will back you." And he was terrific. And of course, he himself wasn't very well. You know,
he was a rheumatologist on the side, wasn't he? Yes.
Yeah. I don't. I would never say I respected him greatly as a physician, because I didn't know him that well, but I respected him enormously as a person. He was a man of great integrity.
And he'd also come through a totally different system to you, hadn't he? I mean, you had prepared yourself not for the Eastern, but for, say, somewhere like the Royal, hadn't you?
Yeah, I suppose so. I mean, I had actually been applying for jobs throughout the UK.
Yes.
And the idea of finishing up in Edinburgh was something which I don't think there was that job, but I didn't have any great desire to finish up in Edinburgh, like, some other people of our era did have.
Yes. Going back to the undergraduate, so it's a long way back, but were the people there in your year who had influences on you? People who had an abiding effect?
They're people who I considered to have had influences on me in the same way as friends have influences on you. Were the people who had influence on me in career sort of way?
Well, just in general, that you felt that you were glad that they were in your year?
Oh yes, lots of them.
What sort of people?
Yes. Well, I mean, I don't know if Ferry-Doon had that effect when we were undergraduates, but Ferry-Doon was the SHO in 32, 33 when I was the registrar.
Right.
And, he was...
Tell us about Ferry-Doon.
Oh, extraordinary both. I mean, as you know, one of the most cultured people who one is likely to ever meet, who, came to Edinburgh, I gather, because his dad said, well, if you want to do medicine, Edinburgh is the place for you, after having been to Harvard and been educated in Switzerland, etc., etc. And he had a much more international approach to medical problems than I had. My approach was patient orientated, whereas his was at least country orientated. So he had a huge impact on me as an individual. In the year, I suppose the people who had most effect were the people who I was nearest to, people like Henry Hamilton, who again was a very interesting bloke, and who took off, spent I don't know how many, 2 years in Vietnam, and then finished up in North America. Ian Weston, a whole series of people. I mean, to some extent, the people I played bridge with, the people who I played hockey with, things like that. But I honestly don't think that I was influenced career-wise by my peers.
So you arrived coming back to the Eastern, you arrived at the Eastern, and how did you tackle it?
Well, even before then, the first thing I was asked to do was not take on Eton Hall. I was actually offered the job which became John Anderton's at the Western. I was offered the transplant unit at the Western instead of sessions at Eton Hall. And I was told that under no circumstances could I discuss this offer with anybody, that I had to make my mind up in a vacuum. And I finally said, the person who offered it me, that I just couldn't do this. I had to discuss it with somebody, and I discussed it with Leslie Duncan, whose advice influenced me, though I think I'd made the decision myself, and the decision was, stuff that's I've just been interviewed for a job, and I've accepted it, and I'm bloody well going to do it. So I turned it down, and that did create quite major ripples in the West, which went on for quite a while, I think. I think I was always viewed with much more suspicion in the West than I actually deserved, put it that way.
Yes.
And I think that was the reason. How did I tackle it? Well, it did divide into two halves. The eastern half of it, one went to the east and said, this unit has got to be improved. And I suppose I was very methodical. I think I said, well, the way I'm going to improve this unit is to get good junior staff working here. And the way I'm going to get good junior staff working here is to teach well. Now, I enjoyed teaching, and I'd always enjoyed teaching, but I think it was a very positive decision.
Right.
And I put an enormous effort into undergraduate teaching. And it paid off. And that after a very short period of time, the people who were applying for that job were quite exceptionally talented. Yes. And it made it very much easier. So that was the immediate approach there. Eton Hall was very difficult, because I just didn't know what to do with Eton Hall. And what I did do was try and establish an outpatient clinic, which I had been told I couldn't do, which was the thing which had totally pissed me off. And that was after I said I'm not going to the West. And, the truth is that I went around the local practitioners and knocked on their door, and I said, I've been told I mustn't see your outpatients, but I've come here to do it. Would you like to refer them to me? And in those days there were some very, very powerful GPs in the neighbourhood, and within a year I built up a lot of outpatient referrals.
That's how you did it, was it?
I advertised. I advertised the service, not myself.
Yes, no, I understand
and I then got in touch with the Regional Health Board, and I said, there are people like Clifford Ratton who are referring patients to me. I knew this was going to happen. Will you kindly write and tell them they can't, because I'm not allowed to see them.
Right.
And I knew damn well they were going to say, okay. At least I gambled that they would.
Yes.
And we got a purpose-built outpatient department, which was great.
And what was in Eton Hall? What sort of people were patients there?
Initially?
Yes.
Well, initially it was still a war pensioners' hospital.
Right.
It was a 60-something bedded all-male unit, and most of the patients were there for a pensionable disorder. They had psoriasis and things like that. And, I think that it would be exceptional to have more than 20 patients in the 60-bedded hospital. And it was a matter of changing that step by step. The first thing to do was to get people to agree we could actually admit women, and then starting, once you have outpatients, you've got patients who can come in, and I started using it as a kind of convalescence unit for the East. So it evolved, and I brought in geriatricians, or tried to, and did. That wasn't initially very successful.
Because when David Seaton went there, which was a long time before you...
No, it wasn't.
Was it not?
No. I actually took over from David.
Because David said that when he first went there, he was the first consultant to do a ward round almost ever.
I don't know if that's true. I've mentioned the person who was there.
Yes.
And he was not well. He was a sick man. He was one of these people who had been very overlooked by the system. It's an extraordinary coincidence. He'd been a senior registrar for something like 18 years, which, obviously tells you something about him. But he had his status taken away from him, and he was actually appointed initially without any form of consultant status. He was appointed medical superintendent of Eton Hall, clinical status unidentified or something like that. And this was when David, not only David, before David, was the consultant. I've digressed. But the point I'm going to make is slightly sensitive. Before David was my father-in-law, Dr. Caird. And the extraordinary thing is that before him, was his father-in-law, Dr.
So it
Goodall.
zigzagged.
Yes, it was an
Right.
extraordinary.
Yes.
And I think that my father-in-law actually was a very, very conscientious.
Right.
And whenever I read in any of the case notes his writing, which was very identifiable, I said,
Nice.
yeah,
Yeah.
and so that.
All right.
But I think there was this period of time
Yeah.
when there was a huge hole there.
Yeah. How did you tackle nursing? Because that was a developing element in Easton, wasn't it? I mean, the nursing was good, but perhaps was it different to what you'd had in the Royal?
Well, probably it was different. It was very committed.
Oh, yes.
I mean, always
Yes.
was. I mean, there had been a school which was at the Eastern, then it linked up with Leith, and then it linked up with the Western. I actually did the same approach. I put an hour aside every week to talk to the nurses in my part of the unit about patients, and they asked who they wanted me to talk about. And I went to the Western and said that I had the divine right to teach the nursing staff in my school, which didn't go down a bundle to start with, but I ultimately actually taught a lot there.
Right.
And, unashamedly would mention, you must remember that you are the North Edinburgh School. So maybe that's another of the reasons why I wasn't too popular in the Western. But, I did it through education. I felt that the way to attract staff was. And the other thing, I suppose, which was fairly deliberate, was the hockey team.
Yes.
Because, if you're talking about the in-word is bonding, I mean, there's no doubt that the Eastern hockey team had an enormous bonding effect in the medical unit.
Yes.
Yeah.
That was always great fun, wasn't it? I mean, people speak very affectionately of that.
Yes, it reached a stage, at one stage, where we were too successful for our own good.
Right.
And I actually became quite worried because the result became more important than...
But did you not also go for a pint in some pub?
Yes.
Yes.
We did.
How did you cope with developing technology? Because that was another area that was, perhaps the Eastern was not quite... it was an evolving period of medicine anyhow,
Yes.
where the time between our being housemen, consultants and retired consultants were on a logarithmic scale rather than on a algebraic or arithmetic rather. How did you cope with developments in technology? Take something simple, blood deliveries, or did that just happen?
I think that happened. I actually think that side of it is less of a problem than you think. If you've got good relationships with the laboratories, and we did have, by and large, we had very good relationships. And particularly we had very good relationships with Dr. Horn, which may surprise you. But he obviously, was...
Very fair man, wasn't
he
he?
was fond of the Eastern.
Yes.
And we had very good relationships with Norman Allen and also with Karen Gould, who used to come down once a week, discuss our problems with us and things like this. So at that time, there was definitely a feeling of belongingness to the laboratories, the central laboratories. So that wasn't. My one-word answer to your question was badly, because I was thinking of the other side of it. Things like pacing, things like all the developments in technology which you could do actually in the laboratory, in the ward. And I think that has always been a concern, that when you're working in a place like the Eastern, the patients you're going to transfer out of it are the illest.
Yes.
And that is a cause of real concern.
Yes, yes. Then you attracted, I don't know if attracted is the right word, but then someone like Liz Shaw became the matron. Was that must have been a good, positive element?
Yeah, it was. Her predecessor was very different, but was somebody who I would never be critical of.
No.
I think the nursing problems in the Eastern occurred at the latter part of my career rather than the beginning of it. But Liz was great fun to work with.
Yes.
That I think she was, she was a nursing colleague who
we knew from the past.
Yes, that's
anyhow,
right.
Didn't we? Yes.
Yeah.
When did you become interested in obesity? And
it goes back a long way. After I got the membership, I went to Leslie and said I would like to do another clinic in DOPD, and he said, you can do the obesity clinic. And I was not entirely polite to him. And I said I'd do it for a year. And at the end of the year, I'd become quite interested, and I was keen to carry on, so I did carry on. So it started there. When I went to the Eastern, I made a number of positive decisions. One was not to set up a diabetic clinic, and one was not to do obesity. Another was not to do obesity. I thought the service exists, and what happened was that the number of obesity referrals to my general medical clinic at the Eastern just started getting more and more and more. And I made either the right or the wrong decision to split it off. And of course, once you did that, you had a snowball. And it was a matter of bringing in other staff to do it, because, there was a time when we had a huge number of obesity referrals every week.
did you feel you cracked it, or did you feel that...
No, I didn't feel that at all. The opposite. I think the more one got to know, the more one realized that obesity is not, the management of obesity has nothing to do with weight loss.
Yeah.
And that, as a lad, your interest was in trying to get, I mean, that was it, in trying to get these people to lose weight. And the more you got to know about it, the more one became concerned about why they were obese and how you could support them without weight loss in their life. They are a very, very sad, by and large, sad group of people who have had a very raw deal from the medical profession.
Yeah.
And I think very few people actually understand the complexities that are often associated with obesity. That when you look at the eating disorders, the amount of emotion that has gone into anorexia nervosa and bulimia nervosa, and people feel terribly sorry for them. But people feel very intolerant to people who are just obese.
Yeah.
Although some of them have bulimia with obesity, which is even sadder than bulimia without it. No, they're a very sad bunch of people. But I think that what one realizes is that you can't crack it. It's far too complex. Gone mute.
How did you become involved in the college?
I don't know. I was asked to stand for council a long, long time ago, and did, unsuccessfully. And then I suppose I got asked to go on various committees. So it was that kind of a start to it. I think if I was perfectly honest with you, until very recently, I'd been asked to put things in priority. I felt a much closer sense of loyalty to the university than I felt to the college.
Right. But the sort of culmination of that, if you like, infusion was the getting on the council in '88.
Yes, that was almost by chance. That was the year where there was an election for president, and the unsuccessful candidate was reluctant to have his name put forward as president, and I was one of the people who felt that he would have actually made a very good president, and that he finally agreed to have his name go forward on the understanding that I would at least support him to the extent of standing for council. So the paradox of the situation was that I found myself on council when I honestly felt I had more urgent things to do within the health service at a time when he was not the president. But I suppose that being on council for 2 years does give you a different insight into the way that the college functions and the role that the college is playing in the broader sense.
How did you find those 2 years? I mean, what?
Well, they were very interesting. I mean, Michael Oliver was the president, and I actually think that what Michael did when he was president was very important. I'm not suggesting I agreed with everything he did, either then or subsequently. But that he did introduce a kind of fresh approach, at least I thought he did, into college activity, which I think was badly needed. And he kind of tried to make the college aware of some of the really pressing issues that face medicine rather than face the college.
And so you did your 2 years, and then you went off back into a vigorous life, didn't you, at the Eastern, as medical?
Yes, I don't think I'd ever left the vigorous life, but,
no, but
yes,
or rather...
Yes, I know what you're saying.
And what was it that... Who asked you to be registrar?
Well, Tony Toft asked me that I'd actually nominated Tony to become the president. And he asked me if I would be prepared to do something for college. And I must say, I felt that to say no would have been totally hypocritical when you ask somebody else to stand as president, to say, but I'm not prepared to do anything. So I said, I certainly would as soon as I retired. And shortly after I retired, we met, and he suggested a number of ways in which I could do it, which I actually felt were inappropriate for somebody who had retired. And at the end of this discussion, he kind of finished up by saying, well, that means you're going to have to become the registrar.
So what had you gone there to discuss, or what would you...
Well, how I was going to contribute. I mean, one of the things that had been suggested to me was that I might be the kind of deputy social convener. Now, you might fall about laughing and say that would have been inappropriate, but I thought that would have been an absolutely splendid thing to have been, but I finished up. But that wasn't what he asked me to do. He asked me to consider doing certain things which I really feel should be done by people who are inactive appointments.
Right. So you started as registrar. Now, what did that entail, and what happened during the period when you were registrar?
Well, I started by being proleptic registrar. There was a bit of confusion there, and I feel particularly sorry for my immediate predecessor, because I thought I had been appointed at a time when he was still very much so in office, and although it didn't cause problems, there was this odd situation whereby I increasingly started doing the work. I was given an understanding that there wasn't all that much work involved, and that after a relatively short period of time I came to the conclusion that it was actually a very worthwhile job, and that to do it meaningfully would involve actually putting quite a bit of effort into it.
What had your perception of it had been? You'd been an examiner for many years.
My perception of it had been that you just kind of rubber stamped the civil service organisation of the exams.
Right. But what in fact was it?
What in fact did it change to?
No. Well, when you came into the job.
Well, I think that's what it was.
Yes. So that it was right. And how did the sort of exam work then? I mean, when you first came in 1993.
That's right. Yeah.
What was the format of the registrar's place? The exam was running in Edinburgh, and
Can I not answer that question? Can I just change it on its head?
Yes.
I think that I'm going to talk about a person, and I'm going to talk about Lindy. I think that Lindy is a very exceptional person. I think that she is, somebody who really is incredibly committed to the examination department and to the college. The reason why I'm digressing is that she had a very, very difficult job. She had been working with somebody whose approach was hands-off approach, and suddenly found that she was working with somebody whose approach was very different. I wanted to know what was going on, and I wanted to know how it could be improved. And I must have been a pain in her butt, but she never gave me that impression. And we actually, I like to think, finished up with a fantastic working relationship, that I really enjoyed working with her. I didn't know about her in other than as a name, and certainly she was the unexpected bonus of becoming the registrar. It was very exciting to be working with her at a time when, having realised that I wasn't, that I was somebody she could work with, we tried to make a number of changes. A lot of them of a very minor level, but the cumulative effect, I think, was hopefully was advantageous.
Can we go back a wee step? What is the job description of the registrar?
Well, there isn't one. I don't know if there still is. I actually asked, when I was taking on the job, I asked for a job description. That is wrong. I actually wrote one for Neil, and was told it didn't exist. And I then asked for the civil service to write me a job description, which I think was wrong, and I was told it was wrong, and I recognise that that is an office bearer's job rather than a civil service job. But it didn't exist at that time. I think that there are certain different layers to the job. I mean, one is the organisational layer, and the other
of the exams.
Yes, of the exam. I mean, it's everything to do with the exams which are run by the college. Full stop. That's the job description. To be the office bearer responsible for that.
Does it overlap into JCHMT and things like that?
Not really. No. No, I didn't find that a problem.
No.
I think what it more overlaps into is the International Medicine Committee, that was subsequently set up.
Right. And so how did you evolve the exam system?
How did it evolve? Because I don't think any one person...
No, how did it?
And I would like to recognise the fact that a lot of the things, the changes that took place when I was a registrar were some related to the presidents and council of the day as well. I mean, it started at a very fun, simple level of looking at the examiners who we had and saying how many of them have passed their sell-by date, and trying to get new blood in, looking at the host centres, and I visited almost all the host centres. I invited myself to all of them. One of the ones I didn't visit because I was not invited to come to it was the Western. But I did go round the host centres, and I talked to the host examiners about their local problems, and that actually gave me much more insight into the organisation of the exam. We recruited for new examiners. We started making sure that all the examiners observed before they examined, which our sister colleges had been doing already. So there were these really quite basic changes to start with. And then introducing the concept that, and Alison Jones was the person who kind of stimulated me here, that there was no reason why collegiate members shouldn't be involved in aspects of the examination, such as the marking of the written papers. And then really parallel with that, after a period of time, I became the chairman of the policy committee. And suddenly it became a MRCP UK situation.
Now, what is the policy committee?
When I became chairman of it, it was the policy review committee
Of
of
this
the
college?
the intercollegiate.
Right.
A previous senior censor of the London College had made recommendations about changing the examination, and these were discussed by the three colleges, and it was agreed that they should look at them, and they set up a committee to review the MRCP UK, and it was under the chairmanship of the then chairman of the Part 2 board, who was James Syme. And they looked at the recommendations of the senior censor and concluded that there was no need to change the examination, and that in particular those recommendations were not viable. The committee continued to function for a period of time and stopped actually reviewing the MRCP UK, and was actually indirectly given some extra functions at a time when I became its chairman. And the immediate extra functions were the Tony Toft initiative of taking the examination in the first instance to Malaysia and to Singapore, and then to the Middle East, etc., etc. And we actually, there was a very serious discussion took place as to whether they should scrub the whole thing. You don't keep a review committee once it's undertaken its review, or whether they should drop the name review. And the decision was taken to drop the name review, so that it became the committee that sat between the joint meetings of the presidents of the three royal colleges and the Part 1 and Part 2 board. And really it was the vessel through which all recommendations about the examination reached presidential level. Has that answered your question?
Mm-hmm. And so during this time, how did things evolve? First of all, with the extension to Malaysia and Singapore, did the initiative for that come from Malaysia and Singapore, or did it come from Britain?
It came from Tony Toft. What happened was that Tony had been going around the world asking people what they thought about holding the exam locally. And he then organised in this college, with all the colleges attending, a meeting to which Pakistan, Bangladesh, Singapore, Malaysia, Sri Lanka, and one other were invited.
Hong Kong?
No, because they were already on board. And Myanmar.
Right.
And that was very interesting. You know, it was what do you want and what can we offer kind of one-day meeting. A very, very productive one-day meeting.
And who came to it? Who were the people who came?
Well, it was attended largely by the presidents of the appropriate institutions. I think, to all respect to Tony, he got it slightly wrong, because he invited the presidents of the academies in Malaysia and Singapore, and they're not really the equivalent of our colleges. They weren't responsible for the examinations. The universities were responsible for the examinations.
Right.
And the upshot of that meeting was that the representative of the Malaysian academies said that they would welcome the exam. And Singapore said they wouldn't, but they changed their minds subsequently. And then some other countries started falling into us.
And what was the attitude of Pakistan and Bangladesh?
Bluntly, their attitude was that they would love to hold the MRCP INT in their country, but it would be their examination with our stamp on it.
Right.
And basically we said, that isn't what we're discussing. So there had been some misunderstanding about what was on offer. I think that they felt that
So there's no potential for, if you like, selling the exam as a franchise system. It would remain in the UK.
No, there wasn't. I'm not saying that isn't something which shouldn't be discussed in the future, but what was being discussed was avoiding having to get candidates to travel all the way to the UK to sit an exam in a hostile foreign environment rather than in their own environment. But it was a matter of saying, would this be of advantage to your candidates and would it be of advantage to your educational system? And obviously quite a number of countries saw it as actually a threat to their postgraduate educational system. And of the countries that have embraced it, it's been quite interesting because each, I think, so far has embraced it for a slightly different reason.
Yeah. What sort of reasons do they? I mean, why is it attracted to Malaysia and Singapore, but not?
Well, yeah. I mean, Malaysia. At the time when these discussions were taking place, the responsibility for postgraduate education was entirely within the universities.
Right.
They ran a master's program. The number of people who obtained the masters in medicine were very, very restricted indeed. That I may have my figures wrong, but it was something like enrolling 15 a year into the program. Maybe an understatement. But it meant that they weren't producing anything like the number of consultants they required. There were others going in paediatrics. So they were having to look elsewhere to get people who were trained. And one of the places not by any means exclusively, the places they were looking to was the UK. And people who had their membership were then allowed to proceed without obtaining masters, but they were never quite recognised in the same sort of way. That the government service was dependent upon the university service, and that when they seconded people from the government service, they actually lost them. They had to work in the university environment for 4 years. So there was a good deal of friction between the government service and the university. And that basically, I think that it was at a ministerial level, the suggestion was made that it would be a good idea to have the membership locally so that they could have two streams to achieve the necessary number of specialists.
So that in Bangladesh and Pakistan and Munro, as it was,
Yes.
they had an academy-based postgraduate qualification, as opposed to a university or a selective.
They had a college-based.
Yes.
It was much nearer to our.
Yes. So the need was much less.
Well, it was deemed to be different. Yes.
Yes.
And if we take Malaysia on a stage, I mean, I think one of the best things that happened has been that, in actual fact, as a consequence of the membership coming there, they have opened up the masters to many, many more candidates.
Right.
And now you don't have to spend all 4 years working in the university. You can actually sit your masters through a government service.
Right.
So it may be quite a short-term situation. But the really encouraging thing is that the government have actually, they've fully recognised the membership, but they've said that they will no longer sponsor people to come to the UK. They will have to sit it either in Malaysia or in Singapore, so that they want to develop it as a local examination.
And is it easy to get quality examiners there?
Well, every pair of examiners includes a UK-based examiner.
Right.
I think the other examiners at the moment are of very high quality indeed. They've all come here, they've all been observed and examined in the UK before we let them loose locally.
And has the character of the exam changed during the 3 years that you've been involved?
It has to a minor extent, and it's about to a major extent. That, I mean, the policy committee did actually or Policy Review Committee, in spite of the decision that had been taken, they continued to review the exam, and there were a whole series of minor changes which I felt clearly needed to be introduced, and because I was persuaded by listening to other people, they weren't my initiatives. And we started doing this in a fairly methodical sort of way. At least I thought it was. And then we took one proposition to the 3 Royal Colleges, and that related to the mark of 9 in the written paper.
Now, what is the mark of 9?
Currently in the Part 2 examination, the mark, it's a peer-referenced marking system, which is arranged so that 60% of candidates get a mark of 10 or more and pass, and 25% of candidates get a mark of 8 or less and are not allowed to proceed to the clinical exam, and 15% get a mark of 9. And that meant that they could proceed to the clinical examination, but they had actually failed the written paper. Now, nobody told them that they'd failed the written paper. And in order to pass the whole exam, instead of getting an aggregate mark of 25, they required a mark of 27, which was difficult to achieve. And that without putting too fine an emphasis on it, the accuracy in the marking system was questionable. That it is all hand-marked. And that my suspicion was that there were some people who were given a mark of 9 who actually warranted a mark of 10 and vice versa. The whole thing was pretty grey. And that just one mark in the whole written paper could make the difference between a 9 or a 10.
Right.
But then you needed 3 extra marks in order to pass in the clinical. And it just seemed to me, and to other people, to be an injustice. So that we produced various suggestions to resolve this. And we were given the bum's rush first time round by the 3 Royal Colleges. And I think that certainly incensed me, and I think it upset just about everybody, maybe not everybody, but the vast majority of people on the policy committee. Why have a policy committee if the colleges don't then listen to the policy? And we asked if we could undertake a major review of the exam. Now, in parallel, John Cash here had set up the Edinburgh College's major review of the examination, so the whole thing fitted in quite nicely. And the policy committee did indeed undertake this major review, which has now been accepted by the 3 colleges.
Why was it why was the minor change, or modest changes, unacceptable? Is it, and the major acceptable? I mean, was it required?
Well, I think what you're always talking about is an educational process.
Yes.
You know, you're trying to teach people why you're trying to change things, and that people suddenly became very enthusiastic about changing the exam from being quite reactionary about changing the exam.
Right.
The proposals that have now been made are really very radical. Whether they will all be implemented is another matter. And the problem that we've immediately encountered relates to things like the computer system and how you can actually affect the changes. But I think there is a momentum which can't now be stopped. I think the exam is going to radically change, and I hope that at the end of the day it will be seen to be fairer. But the critical thing is really saying, are you going to criterion reference or are you going to norm reference? Are you going to say candidates who have acquired the following knowledge deserve to pass part 1, whether they're in the top 35% or not? And are you going to allow candidates who can apply that knowledge to pass, whether they're in the top 60% or not in part 2? And the answer, I believe, when the exam is being used as the entrance for higher specialist training, has to be yes. You cannot justify norm peer referencing. You've got to have criteria. And that's a huge undertaking, because you've got to understand, you've got to ask yourself, well, what do we expect of a successful candidate.
If you had been, the exam has grown like Topsy, hasn't it? If you had been at the beginning, at the start of the MRCP UK, would you have set it up in the same way as it evolved?
Well, I think medical education is growing. And that I think the most important thing is that you need a system which is much more flexible than the system we've got, which you can change. And I hope that it will be the outcome of this. That I think when it was first introduced, the MRCP UK, a lot of people might have considered it was a fair exam. It's only when you've experienced it, when you're aware of some of the anomalies of it, you say, well, this is not. It's not a bad exam. I think it's a very good exam, but we can improve it.
How does the exam enable the intuitive position? I mean, you've talked about some of your, not models, but certainly influences. And some of them were very intuitive. Do you think they were intuitive because they had a very big database?
I guess they did. I mean, the biggest justification that I've heard about the present Part 1 exam is that it makes you do your reading. If it weren't for that, you wouldn't, do your reading. Yeah. I think that the present Part 1 exam allows people who have no clinical abilities to proceed to Part 2. Fair enough. But much worse so, it prevents some people who have difficulties sitting MCQ type exam, but who could very easily be trained up to consultant status. It prohibits some of them from ever having that opportunity. So it's how can you get around that? And I think there are many ways of getting around it. One of them, a simple way, is to stop limiting the number of attempts. That if you've only got 4 attempts and you've failed twice, you go into the exam in a much more sweaty way than if you're going in the first time. And I think people underperform because of the pressure that's put on them.
Yeah. How did you find working with the other colleges?
I was stimulated. That I think there are two things, that they're working with the other colleges and they're working with other colleagues, and that I felt I really enjoyed the policy committee. I went into it at a time when I think there was a feeling of frustration in it, there were a lot of ideas in it, and it just required a chairman who was receptive to these, actually to produce results. And that I think the vast majority of people on the policy committee aren't college related, they're exam related, right. They're candidate related. Right. So that was great. There is obviously, you're a senior office bearer, so there is obviously the college interaction. And that is very dynamic. It's all about individual personalities. I became, I like to think, friends with my registrar colleagues in both the other colleges. They're two very different people, one of whom I would trust with my wife, my daughters, my life, the other of whom I would be less certain about trusting with anything. I don't know if I've answered your question yet. Do you want to stimulate me in some other direction? The problem is that at a college level, the exam, unless what's happened in surgery is going to spread to medicine, the exam is a critical component of our revenue. And each of the colleges requires revenue from the membership, and therefore there is always going to be a feeling of competition at a college level, even if there can be cooperation at a committee level. I wouldn't be at all surprised if in 10 or 20 years' time somebody is interviewing my successor who says, and I criticise the registrar, criticise what the Edinburgh College let itself into when the MRCP UK was first set up. And I think the most important thing, and maybe nobody knew how it was going to evolve, the most important thing is not to be too damning about the London College. I mean, the London College at the moment have got a very favourable financial deal, but that's a deal which we agreed to. Mm-hmm. And you cannot blame a sister college for something that you agreed to. My concern, and I don't think it should be the registrar's responsibility, my concern is that with the changes in the examination, either there is going to be a stabilisation of the finances of this college, or there is going to be a destabilisation of them. And I think that we have to be very, very conscious of some of the implications of the changes and the way in which they might affect each of these colleges.
One of the problems that in the computer software world is the one that was faced up by Apple, who didn't franchise their technology, whereas Microsoft did. And that is one of the reasons why Apple are struggling. And the same may occur with Cyan handheld computers and else, because they're not franchising. Do you see the future as being developing into franchising, because there are areas of the world which have yet to formalise their exams? I suspect in Europe, I suspect in China, and there's a big future there. Do you see the colleges going there and offering an exam? Do you see them, if they were to go, as offering it on a franchise basis or as MRCP UK?
When a few years ago, if somebody had suggested what you've just suggested to me, I'd say, well, no, I'm not at all happy about that as a proposal. Now, I would say almost the opposite. That I think you're absolutely right, there is an enormous potential to offer something which is not MRCP UK. It could be MRCP INT, it could be anything you like. There certainly is a feeling in large parts of the world that we have something to offer them, and that if we don't offer them, they will look elsewhere, and in particular they'll look to the States, and that the States have been very active, but so are other places. For example, South Africa. They see this as an opportunity to increase their influence as well as to make money. So does the Irish College, who have been very active, and many other colleges. So that there is this awareness that some form of graduate educational package is valuable. There is an increasing awareness of it. I don't know how many countries are actually just interested in the exam. I think they are interested in a package deal. And the question then comes, how much can we actually take on? And I think one of the things we have to be cautious about is taking on more than we can successfully digest. The other problem actually comes back to what I've just said, that I have a feeling that the Scottish colleges are much more internationally orientated than the London College. That I think that the London College would be, certain senior people in the London College, maybe a majority of them, would be enormously relieved if the Scottish colleges collectively, or at least one of them, went under because they became bankrupt. And therefore one almost wonders, is it in their interest the London College's interest to develop the franchise concept, even though it might, in the short term, be to their financial advantage. It's also going to leave them this bizarre competition within the UK.
Right. Can we change to a totally different topic?
Yeah.
One of your abiding passions has been pictures. How did that start?
I think it started at a very early age. You know, I remember my father taking me to exhibitions during the war in London and things like that.
Because you wear watches, weren't you? You wear watches.
I wear?
You wear watches. You used to go to sales about clocks.
Well, I mean, there's a sales. I mean, the sales addiction is parallel. The two kind of came together. But
right.
I think it's. I think that my mother-in-law was responsible for my interest in sales.
Right.
As a medical student, I used to go to sales. That it used to be, before watches, it used to be carpets. Or Eastern rugs.
Yes.
And I could tell a terrible story about myself, that there was a chap who obviously thought, as all patients who think this are mistaken, he thought that I had saved his life for totally inappropriate reasons. And he ran an antique shop actually in George Street. And when I was going to Phillips, to Lyon & Turnbull's sales to buy Eastern carpets, he used to come up to me and say, "I don't know, anything you fancy?" I said, "Yeah, rather like that little Bellucci 215. And this is when I was a resident. And it was a Saturday sale, I don't know if you remember it. And we waited on a Sunday. And so Saturday was a day I sometimes had off. And I'd buy it for £3. I'd take it home and I'd clean it. And I'd put it on the floor. And then somebody would come in and I would sell it for what I'd bought it for. And often I'd go and I'd say, "No, I'm not interested." And there was this fateful day, and I said, "No, I'm just here to watch the bidding." And there was this huge, great carpet. I still remember its design, and it was going to sell for £10. I thought, "This is ridiculous." I started bidding. And I suddenly became aware of this atmosphere in the room. Everybody had gone quiet. I stopped bidding, and at the end of it, this guy came over to me. He's purple in the face. "Never again, never again. Do you know what you were doing?" And I drove home, and I couldn't work out what the hell he'd been talking about. And I suddenly said, "Oh my God, I've been in a ring." And this chap had obviously gone round to all his fellow antique dealers and said, "John Munro, who saved my life, wants to buy the Bellucci carpets." And I never bid against a dealer. And that was the end of that particular exercise. But that was different. Now I think the pictures were, although they have married, they were separate. When I went abroad, I always came home with a print of the place as my kind of memento of it. We used to go to the Scotsman Steps. Do you remember those exhibitions?
Yes.
And Ginny and I, we bought a picture each year at the Scotsman Steps. So I had this interest, just ongoing interest. And then there was somebody who was a friend and a neighbour, and also latterly became a patient, who was the professor of veterinary surgery, who used to talk about his layabout son-in-law, who graduated from Dundee and then spent a year in Holland and then 6 months in the States on 2 art scholarships. And he came back, and I said to Jeannie, "I'll have to go and see." I said I wanted to see his work, and I said I'll have to go and buy something while I'm there. And I was taken apart by his work, and he actually came and painted in our attic for a few years at the weekend, and his name was Phil Braham, and he's now a well-known European, he's got an international reputation. And through him, I really got to know an extraordinary number of young Scottish artist, just before contemporary Scottish art got a kind of, hype. And it's been very invigorating. And so it's a matter of knowing them personally as well as knowing their work. And then organising the exhibitions at the Eastern for 10 years.
You also had, I don't know the correct word, pictures in hospital, didn't you? Were you not involved in that?
Yeah, I was. Paintings in hospitals.
Paintings,
yeah,
yes.
I mean, I was involved. I was putting pictures into the Eastern before Paintings in Hospitals Scotland
Yes.
emerged. And I was for a while what was deemed to be their advisor. I left that because there was a personality problem.
Yeah.
I respect enormously what they try to do. I found, for I think very valid reasons, I found that I could not continue to associate my name with them.
Yeah. Do you have a good eye, or have you learnt?
I don't know. I mean, I've got a good eye.
Sorry?
I've got a good eye.
Right.
I mean, it amazes me. I mean, it sounds very conceited. It amazes me how often I go around a degree show and spot somebody who takes off.
But what is it? Have you analysed it?
No, no way. I have no idea. And it's something that I keep thinking, it's transient. Why should I do it next year? I did it this year. Why should I do it next year?
Yes.
And you do have this feeling that it's very transient, but it doesn't matter a damn. Because the only thing that really matters is your response, not how other people respond. And I can go around saying Ian Hughes is one of the best contemporary young Scottish artists there is. And he is. And if nobody else agrees with that, that doesn't alter the fact that as far as I'm concerned, he is.
Yes.
If other people suddenly realise that I'm right, that's good for them, but it's not going to alter my conceit when it comes to saying he is.
But your original friend, who painted in the attic,
Yeah.
have you been to exhibitions with him and talked about painting?
Oh yeah, I mean I talked a lot to him when he was in the house.
Yes.
And I mean he was a very, very important influence, because not only did he talk about his work, he talked about, in a way which very few artists do, he talked about what he was trying to achieve in his work.
You see, if I talk to John Busby, I find that my thinking has changed totally. And whenever I look at a picture, I find my hands moving like John Busby's hands move when he's talking about a painting. And so one can be.
Oh, enormously influenced.
Yes.
And also, although I would say I don't paint myself, I attended the classes at 369, and I still draw. And people who have taught me are very, very high caliber people.
Yeah.
And you learn from that as well.
Yes.
You learn how difficult it is, if nothing else.
You have been responsible for changing the attitude of the college to painting. Tell us about that. I mean, well, can we go back to that? Were you at all involved in the sale of the Dad?
Yes, I was.
Now, what was your view on that? Did you think it was a good picture?
I thought it was a fascinating picture.
What was it of? I never saw it.
Oh, it's of Morrison standing in front of his house, which overlooked Firth of Forth up.
Who was Morrison?
You don't know anything about
I don't know anything.
Or you're just winding me up.
No, how would I?
Morrison was a president of this college, who also, before the name was invented, was a psychiatrist, who he was interested in nervous disorders, or whatever the phrase was, who got a job. One of his jobs on the side was looking after a number of the asylums somewhere in the south of England. I can't tell you exactly where. Richard Dad was a schizophrenic who had murdered his father. And Morrison found Dad incarcerated in his lunatic asylum and got him painting again. And Dad, I think, I may be wrong, but I think he only painted 2 portraits, one of which is of Morrison. And, my kind of fantasy is that Morrison said to him, well, why are you buggering around doing nothing? It's about time you made use of your extraordinary artistic skills. Start painting me. And Morrison got, I think it was either a sister or daughter, to paint their house and garden, a little watercolour, which he then gave to Dad, and Dad used this to form the background of his portrait of Morrison, so that there is this rather stilted person standing in a suit in front of this house and garden. And of course it's an incredibly important picture. It's a painting by a murderer of his therapist. It's, one of the first forms of contemporary art therapy there is. It's a very important British picture. It was gifted to the college by Morrison's descendants and got then lost in the basement, where it was found by, I've forgotten his first name, Cruikshank, the father of...
yes.
Okay.
Not Donald, yes.
His father. Okay.
Yes.
And...
Alistair.
Yeah, that's right, and recognised to be what it was. It was taken to the National Portrait Gallery, and they cleaned it, and they said, we said it was far too valuable to stay here, so they actually kept it after it had been found. And there was another much better portrait of Morrison, which is hanging in the Great Hall, the kind of stuffed shirt portrait of Morrison, which was, as far as the college was concerned, all they wanted. And then, as you know, there was the question of selling it. And I was very opposed to its sale. And what I suggested was that it shouldn't be sold. It should be part gifted to the National Portrait Gallery. And that the condition of the part gift should be that it couldn't leave the UK without the college's permission. We would obviously let it go, but this would be our condition to it. And I believe that if one more person had voted against its sale, it would not have been sold. So it wasn't a matter of not keeping it. I felt that this was very important. It was a museum. It was a national. It could be in England as easily as Scotland, but it was nationally important. I was very concerned it was going to be sold to somebody in the States or anywhere else. And the compromise was that it was actually sold by Agnews. So it didn't get sold at auction. They got in touch with Agnews, who sold it privately, and they took 25% commission, and they sold it to the National Portrait Gallery. So we got bad press because one of the Sunday papers found out about this and said, can a responsible institution be prepared to get rid of a national heirloom in this way? And we got less money. Because I reckon if we'd gone to them and part gifted it, we'd have actually finished up with more. And then, of course, what I said was, well, you've got all this money, you should be spending some of the interest on it, on replacing it by contemporary art.
And what has been your philosophy about contemporary art in the college, though? What have you tried to build up?
Well, I don't know if it's me. I mean, I think there are a number of people. I think that...
But you're not without your modest influence on it.
No, not without influence on it. I think there are two different aspects to this. The first is that I think that if you talk presidents, I think that it's nice to have, it's good to have, nice is a terrible word, to have a presidential portrait rather than a mugshot. I think it should tell you much more about the person. And by doing that, we can actually be positively supporting young artists working in Scotland as distinct from Scottish. Okay. I think working in Scotland would be my preference. So that's one side of it, and I think it's great that we now have this agreement. The other is that I think that there is a place to be said for saying, particularly in the contemporary part of the college, this is an appropriate place to hang contemporary paintings.
What are the presidential pictures that have pleased you?
All of them.
All of them. Does all have a relativeness?
Well, I mean, some have pleased me more than others. I mean, I think the two that I particularly was delighted to see was the small painting of John Crofton by Sandy Gardner. I choose this one deliberately because I know it's caused sensitivities, but I think it is a fantastic, a sympathetic painting of somebody who I think they actually catch the spirit of him. It has been painted as he is, or was at the time he was painted, rather than when he was the president. And if he looks like an old man, it's because he is an old man. And that is not meant in any way to be derogatory. And the other one is the massive picture of John Strong by Paul McPhail, which I think actually is an incredible painting. I don't think it, as a portrait, has the same relevance as the John Crofton one. I mean, it could be of other people, but it is, I think, it's a fantastic painting. Paul McPhail is a very interesting bloke. He's the partner of Jenny Savile, and most people would say that he is a better artist than Jenny Savile, though of course she has got all the accolade, and he has actually stopped painting. He is now her
husband.
That's right. My own suspicion is that some of the work has got a Paul McPhail influence in it. Well, I'm sure a lot of it's got a Paul McPhail influence, but I think some of it has more than that. You know.
What about Tony Toff's portrait with his? Who painted that?
Yeah, that's a chap called Sandy Fraser from Aberdeen. I think he was the head teacher. He wasn't the head of the art college grade, but I think he was either number 1 or number 2. He is recognised to be one of the best figurative paintings, I think, in Scotland currently living. I mean, Tony chose. What I did at that time was show Tony a number of. I think he was presented with 5 portfolios, and he chose Sandy Fraser's work from what he'd seen of it, and that he had said that what he was really interested in was a picture, not a portrait. And I would almost paraphrase what he's saying, because he said that after all, in a few years' time, very few people will remember what he looked like, and anyhow it didn't really matter what he looked like. What he hoped was that if a portrait was going to be painted, it would be a picture that people would look at and say, that's a cracking picture. And I think that was a change in emphasis. I'm not saying it's what other presidents should do, because I think it should be left to the individual.
Is there any significance of the background? The background scene?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of significance to the background, but I think you'd have to ask Sandy Fraser what it is. I don't know if you were there at the unveiling.
Yeah.
Well, he talked a bit about it, not very much, but because he said, I'm leaving a lot of it to other people to decide. The figure on the extreme left, as you look at the picture, is actually Sandy Fraser himself, and he said he painted himself as he thought Tony would be seeing him as he was having his portrait painted. The cat was a cat that Sandy Fraser comes into his studio in Aberdeen from time to time, and when he put it in, it was kind of one of these spur of the moment things, and he then discovered that Tony Toff was totally averse to cats, and he said that he was very tempted to remove it and decided not to. And my own feeling about it is that the cat is very important. Here is Tony in his usual implacable way, or apparently implacable way, riding out all sorts of problems from storms, even with this offensive cat underneath his chair, and he's brushing it off. So I mean, and he went through quite a number of the other bits of imagery in the picture, but he really said it's for you to decide what I'm trying to get at and to interpret yourself.
Some of the other pictures, for example, one of Christopher Clayson is a much more conventional painting, isn't it?
Yeah.
Of which I think highlights a particularly wonderful man.
Yeah.
Some of the other pictures might be less flattering, or maybe more realistic. Is that, without going too...
Well, Michael Oliver's picture I like very much. I don't know if you're asking me to allude to any. I mean, Victoria Crowe, I think, is a remarkable artist. And I actually think that she caught something about Michael Oliver, which I can see in that picture. So I think it's the next to Tony Toft as a painting rather than just a portrait.
Right.
The ones which I was associated, the Ronnie Robertson one, I was very anxious that it should be realistic,
Yes.
representational, and I think it's a picture which, in that context, has worked very well.
I think they have done, but I think that perhaps two very real people in the college, Halliday Croom, who was someone who I
Yeah.
was very influenced by. One feels what a shame that he was not painted by one of the painters in the flesh.
Yeah, I mean, it was. I think it's a great shame. The only thing that I can say is that his sister, who's still alive, I showed the portrait to her, and she was delighted with it.
I'm sure she was, but then the photograph was very good.
Yes, I mean, it is a photographic likeness.
Yes.
And it is very difficult to, particularly if you're just working from one or at most two photographs, it's very difficult to get more than that into it, I think, because you don't really know.
And it would have been interesting to know what his wife would have,
Yes.
made it, because she was an actress and she might have looked to something more like John Strong's picture.
Yes.
To have captured.
It was a very deliberate decision on my part, rightly or
And
wrongly.
rightly so,
I felt that the late presidents were different to the past presidents.
Yes.
And the late presidents, I was very anxious that they should be representational.
Yes.
Full stop. Yeah.
Do you? The picture of the girl in the, I don't know the names of these rooms, the Duncan room.
Yes, that's nothing to do with me. That's a John Anderton gift.
Is it?
And that's the reason why I said it's not just John Munro, and particularly John. John has been was very generous in a number of pictures that he actually has gift to the college.
Yeah. Yes. One last area. One of your donations to medicine, if you like, was your trips to Libya. You can't have been pleased every time that came up. That if you were living a busy life. Tell us about Libya.
Yes. How long have you got? I mean, I think there's a lot of misunderstandings about the situation in Libya. The first ever graduates from Tripoli were in 1980. They based their curriculum on Scottish universities in general, Glasgow in particular. They made a deliberate decision to have, throughout their clinical course, somebody from the UK teaching in medicine, surgery, paediatrics, obs and gynae, and something else. So you went out in groups of 5 and taught there for 2 weeks, and one took annual leave to do it. And they also made this decision that the examination standard would be set at a UK level by having UK examiners. And I went out a few times to teach, and then it was invited to examine, and subsequently have examined. It seems one of these odd paradoxes that a lot of people feel very sympathetic to Iraqi doctors and feel that we must do everything we can to help them because they come from a repressive regime. Whereas an awful lot of people think that all Libyans are terrorists. And they're not all terrorists. A lot of Libyans who I know individually are very charming people. They're very West-oriented people. That they find some of the things that have happened to their country inexplicable. And I talk particularly about sanctions. And this is not trying to be in any way an apologist to Gaddafi. I don't think Gaddafi is one of the most evil leaders in the world. I'm not, again, saying that he... But I think one of the paradoxes about Gaddafi is that he claims to have done things that he hasn't done. The Berlin bombing is a very good example of that. And therefore got his nose bloodied, because this was a way that he impressed Libyans by saying that he'd done this terrible thing or that terrible thing. They are a country that is desperately in need of support from out with their own country. That they're terribly appreciative of any contribution at the medical level. I am very concerned about them, about the country. Since sanctions was introduced, what's happened is you've got black market, and you can't have black market without racketeerism. And that from a country which was very uncorrupted when I first went to it, now I think there is much more corruption. And I think what's happened has been, if Gaddafi had left some time ago, my belief is that we would have almost certainly had a very moderate Arab replacement government. I think now that's much less likely. I think that the West has got it wrong, and that we might finish up with something which is much worse than Gaddafi when he finally steps down or is stepped down.
Was it an enjoyable experience examining the teaching?
It's always unique. I mean, the teaching was fantastic. I mean, you had one bunch of students for 2 weeks, and at the end of them you really felt that you'd actually changed them in a way you don't change students in 2 weeks in the UK, because you're at their throats for about 5 hours in a day.
Yeah.
Examining is actually now very distressing, because we still try to maintain a UK standard, and the pass rate is abysmally low. The last time I was out there, second last time I was out there, we passed, I think it was 23% of them. And the person who I know best there, Libyan who I know best there, is a Manchester graduate, came up to me at the end of the exam and he said, "You've let us down." I said, "Well, I'm just doing very well." He said, "You passed 50% more candidates than you should have. What is the point of our calling you here when you let these people through?" So there is a very conscientious wish, amongst a lot of Libyans to really try and have a high quality health service, and we're not helping.
But of course numbers become important, isn't it? If you pass 50% is...
it does become important. I mean, the point is, at the moment, they've got a lot of people there who are not committed because they're expats, and what they're trying to do is to replace these people with Libyan graduates.
Yeah.
And I think what is happening is that they're replacing, increasingly, they've got their own graduates are more cynical. They have lost their altruism. They look at the West, they say, what are the West playing at? They feel very threatened by fundamentalist Islam. It's not far away from where they are. It's on either side of them. There is some in the country. And I actually see this as the emerging force. Kind of a right wing versus a fundamentalist Islam. And the moderation is disappearing from the country.
I think, is there anything we haven't covered?
We've covered enough, I'm sure of that.
Smashing, thank you very much.
Okay.